The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibilities for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast that aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community. Welcome back to another episode of the Enough podcast. I am one of your hosts, Kendra Sheets.
I'm the other host, Rich Gill.
You could be a little more excited, Rich. It's our 71st episode. It is the end of the year.
I am excited. Party.
This is a Subtext episode. Normally on Subtext, we do more of a shortened format. We talk about current events, all been relating to abuse, assault, sometimes celebrities. Sometimes we do deep dives into definitions and terms. But this one is going to be our 2024 end of the year wrap up.
So, as opposed to our other episodes that most of you or some of you are used to hearing, we're just going to kind of talk about some of the stuff that happened over this past year, topics that we've covered that have been in the news, and what you can sort of look forward to coming up next year, which we covered a little bit on our last episode, but we'll dive a little bit deeper into that and talk more about it here.
So we started doing Subtext, I think, about 2 years ago. We were trying to expand content, giving some of the people an additional format. I know that some of the original critiques that we got, not the negative garbage review critiques, but the actual informed critiques about people who were trying to be complimentary and really wanted to involve themselves in some way in the community and the podcast. The interviews with survivors are really hard to listen to, especially if you yourself are a survivor, and they could be very triggering. So we came up with Subtext. It's still about the same thing that the entire podcast is about, but we started to hone in over the last year and a half or so on a lot of celebrity actors, musicians, and their cases of sexual assault. And one of the things I think we, to pat ourselves on our back, did really well this year was put some additional light on some kind of well-worn situations that everyone kind of knew about, but no one really was doing anything about at the time. The first one, probably the most infamous of all the ones that we talked about this year, is that in February, on February 7th, on our Subtext episode, we did a deep dive into Puff Daddy, Diddy, Sean Combs, and the history of assault, abuse, violence, everything that comes along with Diddy. And then in September of this year, on the 16th, he was arrested for racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution, and the one comment that I think that will go down in history, which was the 1,000 bottles of baby oil for those fuck parties that he was hosting. He actually, as of the recording of this podcast today, was just denied bail, and the case is active. It's ongoing. We've got no real updates at this point, but he is in prison for a number of different charges. And these are the things that people have been, kind of like with R. Kelly, knew about for years, had been talking about for years. The community was aware of them for years, and no one of any sort of legal or higher realm was doing anything until they were.
When we did this episode, Diddy was not in the news in the way that he is today. Like we said, he wasn't arrested until September 16th. We did this back in February. And there was some stuff out there about him, but not to the degree that we found out later. And, one of the things that I think is important to point out with these Subtext episodes is, yeah, we will cover high-profile stuff that is, has really hit the mainstream media. We've talked about Marilyn Manson, we've talked about Harvey Weinstein, we've talked about Johnny Depp. All of those were very much in the news when we talked about them, and everyone was talking about it. With the Diddy case, we kind of covered that before everyone was really talking about it. Like Kendra said, there was some stuff out there. Diddy's history is well documented, and when it comes to abuse and harassment and assault against exes and people he's worked with and there's no shortage of stories, but they were scattered all over the place. We, kind of put them in one place so that you didn't have to spend, an hour going down different Google rabbit holes, which we did when researching this episode. So I think that's something that we've been kind of good at doing is finding these stories that haven't hit mainstream media yet, but have later on.
I would actually say that they have hit mainstream media in some way.
They
Like
have.
everyone kind of knew about Diddy, and the next one that we're going to talk about is Chris Brown. I mean, people knew about Chris Brown since the moment he
Yeah.
smashed the shit out of Rihanna's face. But I don't know that people knew or are aware if you're not part of that sect of music industry, if you're not into that type of music, you might not be aware that he has an elongated history of violence. So it's certain things make it to certain areas. And like if they hit that like Uber 200% everybody knows about it kind of situation, like everyone knows about Diddy at this point. It's in the news consistently. There's
Oh yeah.
updates. I mean, you Google it, those are like the first 3 pages on the search that show up.
The other thing with Chris Brown, to bring up the Rihanna thing, is I think that was the one thing that everybody knew about. Everybody knew that he
Yeah,
beat the shit out of Rihanna. And then it just sort of like went away. And then every
right.
once in a while, he'd hit the news for something like the Good Morning America or Today Show interview where he ripped off his shirt and threw a chair out a window.
Yeah.
Like people knew about that, but then, again, he's sort of faded out of the news, even though there was all this stuff that was still happening.
Yeah, so on July 3rd on Subtext we cover Chris Brown. And actually in this year, a couple months ago, October, a documentary came out called The History of Violence.
Which was eerily similar to the title of our episode, History of Violence, Abuse, and Harassment, I believe it was.
Right. Um, I don't think it's correct to say that, like we're ahead of the curve and we've, figured these things out. These are common things that are out there. And I know I'm going to keep going back to R. Kelly for this because being in the city of Chicago, that was such a huge hit to so many members across different communities in this very vast city. But an example of that is I have a person that I work with who knew as a young girl on the south side of Chicago that if R. Kelly pulled up to your high school, you don't get into that car. And if he shows up somewhere where you are, you don't go with him. Because it was a thing where parents were telling their kids this. There's this kind of weird phenomena that we deal with in at least this country because of the stigma around sexual abuse, harassment, assault. These things are out there because of the power dynamics, usually men, usually powerful men, because as we've talked about a million times, sexual assault is not usually for sexual gratification as much as it is for a power grab in some way. So these cases usually are well known. They're known within like a DIY stuff to the music community, like we talk about on a regular basis. They're known on a large scale. And with some of these people that we've talked about in the subtext episodes, they're known on a national, if not international scale, but they're not at a point where someone's done anything with them yet. And it's when the women or the survivors come together and they lob the 3 or 4 person lawsuit at Harvey Weinstein, and then 10 more people come forward, that's when we really see things hitting the news. And that's where we're at with some of these cases.
And also, we can't get it twisted that with some of these cases, maybe not Diddy or Harvey Weinstein. Again, to go back to R. Kelly, definitely that one. A lot of these victim survivors were poor Black women, poor Black girls. And if he was pulling up to white schools and bringing white teenagers into his little harem or whatever you want to call it, it may have been bigger news. But because America cares so little about its Black and brown populations in a national level, especially when it comes to the news, it was able to continue for as long as it did.
Now, let me challenge you. Not that I don't agree with you, but let me challenge you with our third one here because something is on the table now that has the ability to correct the decade plus long sins that it has imparted across the entire United States on its traveling circus of bullshittery. So on August 7th, we did an episode of Subtext about Warped Tour. We got a lot of really great feedback about it. A lot of people in the punk community shared their stories about Warped Tour, not just women. There's a lot of survivors out there and a lot of people who have seen things. A lot of people who ended up at those behind the scenes barbecues at night who watched some shit go down. And they were more than willing to share with us in agreement a lot of the things that had happened. So that was August. And then in October, almost like we unfortunately willed it into fruition, Warped Tour made some sort of announcement that they are going to return, hooray, in 2025 in at least 3 cities. So they're going to do kind of a When We Were Young fest type old people revival, I'm assuming, where it's going to be more of a nostalgia based festival kind of theme with a lot of those bands that are prime for doing a 25 to 30-minute set because they are too old to do too much more without winding themselves. But as I was saying earlier with Rich, like there is an option now to make sure then you're putting Warped Tour back on the table. We don't know the age dynamics. People my age, Rich's age, anywhere in between, possibly young, like who's going to be there? Anyone from 12 through 65, maybe? There's going to be people there that have kids, kids that are teens, kids that are 10 years old. There is an option right now for them to do the things that they refused to do for the decades in which there were a number of people being harmed at Warped Tour. You know, having 2 or 3 Hazy companies or nonprofits in a tent off to the side is not going to do it. There needs to be something more to ensure that there's not a rape culture as soon as you get into that van parking lot or bus parking lot. Because that's how it's been. That's how it was for a very long time. It's what I experienced. It's what I witnessed. It's what a lot of my friends experienced and witnessed. And as I said, it was all up in our emails as well. People sharing their stories.
They also haven't announced any bans for this yet. So that'll be the other interesting thing, because as we covered on that episode, the list of bans with allegations and convictions that have been on Warped Tour is mind-bogglingly long. There's so many of them. So if it's not just a bunch of bro-y, straight white dudes playing that Warped Tour brand of pop punk or 2000s emo revival stuff, if there are some, you know, a good contingent of women, of queer people, of not just white dudes from the regular Warped Tour bands, that would also be a step in the right direction. Then I'd be like, okay, maybe they are trying to right the wrongs. I have my doubts that that's what it's going to be, but let's hope.
This is one that like I'm very hopeful of. It's something that, as we talked about in our episode, I have a lot of nostalgia for. It was something that was a really important part of my summer every summer for a very long time because it was a way to bring a lot of West Coast bands to the middle of the country where West Coast bands didn't obviously tour there on a regular basis anyway.
My big question for you, Kendra, if they announce a Chicago Warped Tour date, will you go?
I don't know. I need to see the lineup. I need to read a little bit more about like who's behind all of this. It's also a little different for me because I work on a music website as well. I don't always have to pay to get into things, but if it's something that I'm definitely not going to co-sign it in any way, not going to cover it, not going to support it. If it's something where there are people who are obviously problematic, abusive, possible, you know, open doors for violence. And I'm not talking about like broy beatdown, hardcore mosh pit, circle, slam, dance, whatever the fucks. Like I'm talking about if there's someone on there that might toss a 17-year-old into the back of a van forcibly, I'm not going. I'm not going to go there and try and be a one-woman safety wagon for everyone who's there. I just don't have that kind of energy, and it would just scare the shit out of me, honestly.
Yeah, me too. I'm curious, and under the right circumstances, I would go if I don't have to stand out with the rest of everyone else also, because I'm of the age where I don't like to stand out in a field in a large crowd of teenagers and people in their 20s because my feet hurt and my back hurts.
I'll stand, but I also want to know, is it going to be in July or in August in the Midwest? Because I don't know if you guys all know what end of July to like mid-August in the Midwest is like, but like the air is thick with gross. And I don't want to be in that edging on 40.
No, no,
But we'll
absolutely
see.
not.
We'll see what happens. I have hopes that they'll take the steps necessary to ensure safety of all the people that are there.
I'm cautiously optimistic and hopeful that they can turn it
Pull it
around and
off. Yeah.
make it something great that people can enjoy. Because I think, especially kids in this time period, deserve to have something like that we had at that time that meant so much to so many people. And, there's Riot Fest, there's When We Were Young, there's the Fest, but there's no traveling festival right now that does that.
And it's huge for the artists as well
It's
to
huge
get
for
that
the
type of
artists.
coverage.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
So those are a few of the subtexts that we covered that kind of circled back to us in some way this year. We also this year went through and had some interview guests, such as Dr. Nicole Badera. We had Nerdy from Minneapolis. And we've had this throughout the entirety of the podcast. We have these really like star interviewees where they've just kind of knocked it out of the park and they're able to talk about the various aspects of assault and abuse, power dynamics, everything that we always talk about in such informative ways that really shed additional perspectives or even just angles, same perspective, but a different angle on something. And these interview guests from this year have helped us to usher in kind of a new era of the podcast, which we talked about a bit on our last subtext episode, which was a bit about the presidential election, which was, we don't want to keep talking about that. We're going to move forward from that as much as we can as we enter this new chapter. January 20th looms very quickly in the distance. But we've decided that we're going to kind of move away from the more survivor-based story interview format and focus a lot more on these well-informed guests who are able to provide resources and discuss with us in very broad terms how we're, as a culture, as a society, as, a group of people, able to navigate our way through the next 4 years, past that, to navigate these kind of challenging aspects of the world right now and how we can do so while keeping a very supportive community around us, because that's just so important as you're dealing with something that can be upsetting, triggering, possibly dangerous.
And also the two examples that Kendra brought up, Nicole Badera and Nerdy, and some of the, a number of the other people we've talked to, they talk with such passion about this. And that really invigorates us, which is important as the two hosts of this podcast. The way things go, the way things are sometimes, it's very easy to lose momentum, to get disenfranchised, to feel like, what we're doing isn't making a change. But when we have these guests that speak with such passion and they're so informed and know exactly what they are doing and why they are doing it, it really does reinvigorate us and help us realize that what we're doing is important, even if it doesn't always feel that way to us. Not necessarily to other people, but this is important. These are important conversations that we're having, and we're not going to stop having them. We say it all the time, like we're not going anywhere. And having these guests that can help with resources and be more informed than sometimes we are really helps us move in that direction.
The other thing I'd like to mention, because I don't want any of the survivors out there who have thought of coming forward, who put it on the back burner, maybe said maybe next year I'll reach out to them. I don't want you to think that we're not going to go back to that format. This is just up in the air right now. There's something called secondary trauma, which basically means that you can absorb the trauma of another person. And as a survivor myself, I found while I'm also going to school, I'm in grad school currently for social work, focusing on substance abuse, mental health, assault, therapy, while dealing with this, in addition to the podcast and working and dealing with all of my own things through my own personal therapy, it's burning me out in a lot of ways. With the addition of what could happen over the next 4 years, what I've already am assuming is going to happen to some of the communities that I'm invested in, the ones that I have friends that belong to, it's very troublesome. And that secondary trauma becomes a drain. And I would hate to be in a situation for either Rich or myself to be doing this and not be giving it 212% every single episode. So to keep us on track, to keep the longevity of the podcast going, we're just slightly switching the format for this point in time. If you have a story, please feel free to reach out. It doesn't mean that it's going to be an automatic yes, that you're going to make it on at that point, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a no either. We're happy to talk to you. We're happy to hear your story. Please know that we're not turning our backs on the community, on survivors. There will still be an outlet. It doesn't have to always be us, though. There are other outlets out there.
This is really just a natural progression of what we're doing on the podcast, in the same way that Subtext was a natural progression of what the podcast was when we started. As Kendra, sort of alluded to, as we always talk about, one of the goals of the podcast when we started was to normalize these conversations and empower other survivors to come forward with their own stories. That's not changing. That will never change. That's always the most important part of this podcast. And we feel like we've done that. And we know that we've done it because we've been told by multiple people that we have done that. And that is awesome. It feels so good to have that validation. We've been told by, and this blows my mind also, we've been told by multiple bands that they listen to the podcast in their van and talk about the episodes with each other, which is great because as someone on tour, we were always just listening to like AFI or Jimmy Eat World or whatever, not
Let
podcasts.
me also add, though, that one of those people who said that also played a show with one of the bands that got outed on our podcast, like knowing full well that they were one of the bands that got outed. So, like, that's a toss-up. Is it great? Their conversations are being had.
That's
Are
true.
you doing with them what you should? It's up to you. They're out there.
Yeah. I mean, take from the podcast what you will.
Yeah. Maybe don't play with rapist bands, though. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great if people would just stop doing that. But those conversations that are being had, like, we hope that extends to our listeners' daily lives, because it's fucking sure as well happening in mine and Kendra's lives. The amount of conversations I have with friends or people that I've just met, or like it happened at the bar during the festival that I was just doing. It'll start out talking about one thing, and then inevitably by the end of the night, we're sharing trauma with each other and talking about things that happen to us or people that we know. That's just how these conversations go now for us. And that's fine. Like, that's nothing wrong with that. It's great.
I used to share drinks with people, but now I'm sober, so I just share trauma.
You literally and figuratively share tea with people.
The body outcome's the same. You feel really gross afterwards, so.
And since we sort of talked about this pivot, we've gotten a lot of emails and messages, and this was just a couple weeks ago, last week.
I mean, like a week and a half even. Yeah.
And we've gotten so many emails and DMs and text messages from people, and some of them have been less supportive, which is fine, but overwhelmingly, they've been very supportive and thankful for what the podcast has been this entire time, and thankful for what it will continue to be. We know we're not going to make everyone happy all the time. Not everyone is going to like all of our guests or all of the topics we talk about or the way we talk about these things.
And there's a whole bunch of people who don't like the podcast at all, so we're never going to make those people happy.
Or who don't like us personally, and therefore do not like the podcast.
Oh, me?
Or vice versa. All we can do is just put out what we feel are the best episodes that we can and continue to do that. We're not, nor have we ever claimed to be experts in this field. We've gone through training. Kendra's in college right now for this very thing. We've taken classes. We've conferred with professional therapists, lawyers, advocates, but we're not those people. But we are the people who decided to put this in a public forum for people to talk about. And that's what we will continue to do.
I do want to add again kind of where we're going with this. It's going to be more resource driven. It's going to be more educational based, because I think what we're going to need, and this is just me guessing, hindsight, what might happen over the next year or so, is we need to kind of move back into our communities and see what we can do to strengthen on a smaller level. You know, the small DIY shows, the tiny punk venues, your city itself, your state itself. There's a lot that's going to happen over the next so many years. And it's not just presidential, it's just the way that the country is at this point. And we can keep having the same conversations with a different changing face of a survivor over and over again. And those are very impactful. But we're looking to do that plus more. And I think the more people that we can get on the podcast that are inspiring to us, inspiring to hopefully the listener who's able to talk about studies over the last so many years for the book that they've written, like Dr. Nicole Badera. Here's what they've noticed. Here are the tendencies of the people that are doing these things. Here are what survivors are doing to heal themselves and thrive. We've started having the conversations about the abuse. Now I think we need to pivot and start also having conversations about what we can do about the abuse. There is space for both conversations to be had, to share the stories of the survivors, but also to start talking about the resources and how we can heal ourselves as individuals and as a community as a whole.
We also want to talk to the people who are making things happen in their scene, in their community. We want to talk to the younger people who are doing DIY shows and how they are making spaces safer for their scene, for their community. Because if there's one thing that we've noticed over the last several years that we've been doing this, the younger generations are the ones that are killing it with this stuff. All of this is normalized and they don't take shit from anyone. They don't put up with harassment or shitty, creepy people hanging out at their venues, hitting on teenagers. Like, that shit doesn't fly with them. And that is amazing, because mine and Kendra's generation, like, that shit, people got away with that for way too long. So I want to have those conversations, and because those are the people that inspire me also. These young kids who are carrying the torch of what punk rock should be, and indie music and DIY ethics. So let's talk to them. Let's talk to the experts. Let's talk to the people who are doing the things that we all need to be doing over the next however many fucking years this is going to be, for the rest of our lives, maybe.
God, I hope not.
I hope not. Well, maybe our lives will be pretty short, so we don't have to.
Yeah.
But we want to be inspired by people, as we always are. And we want to platform those people and give them the space to talk about what they're doing. They can be survivors. They don't have to be survivors.
And I do also want to state that, we've named a number of people here who hold some, I guess, clout in their community. We had doctors, lawyers, as Rich mentioned. We've had some musicians that have kind of drawn a line in the sand and said, I'm not stepping over this line for these things. And all of those people have found ways to educate themselves in a myriad of different topics that all kind of revolve in the same sphere here. But we've also had people like Bridget and Beck who penned a zine and started a DIY venue in Grand Rapids. They have taught themselves everything by just reading materials that they found on the internet that they were able to gather through libraries and bookstores. Please don't think that this is something where we're turning towards the experts. All of us can be experts.
So that's pretty much what we're looking forward to in 2025. That's the route we're taking. To reiterate, though, do not hesitate to email us, regardless of, if you have a story, if you would just like to talk to us, if you are booking shows, if you are an advocate, if you work at a sexual violence center, anything like that, contact us. If you just want to share your story of something that happened to you, contact us. We read all of our emails. Sometimes it takes us a while to respond because, as we continually point out, we have full-time jobs, we have families, we have animals, we have other things that we do. But we do love hearing from everyone, and we will respond when we are able to. We also have one more interview coming up for this year that'll drop on December 18th. And we actually do have some stuff planned for next year. We take January off, so just be aware of that. When there's no new episodes in January, it's not us just deciding we quit. Every year we take January off to, take some time for ourselves. But we'll be back in February and continue doing what we do and hopefully bringing some positivity to what is going to be a very tough few years for a lot of people.
Plus, we'll for sure give you all of our feedback and commentary on the Warped Tour 2025 lineup, so you'll have to tune back in for that in 2025.
And if that comes out in January, Kendra and I will live record us reading the lineup and commenting on all of the bands.
Yeah, we'll put it on our Instagram of how disappointed we are.
Yeah, so you don't want to miss that.
So thanks for hanging with us. Thanks for staying to the end of our recap. We've got one more interview, and then we'll see you all in 2025 as well.
Enough is a podcast centering on surviving abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, booking agent, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.